From the Arab Spring uprisings to the more recent developments with Iran, is the promise of peace in the Middle East becoming more than just a pipe dream? For many people, the best representation of the turmoil in the Middle East is the Israel-Palestine conflict. The documentary State 194 tells the story of the men and women on both sides of the conflict who are trying to make the two-state solution a reality. Here's a clip.
The conflict between Israelis and Arabs has cast a shadow over the region. Suspicion and hostility has been passed on for generations. But I'm convinced that the majority of Israelis and Palestinians would rather look to the future than be trapped in the past. We see that spirit in the Israeli father whose son was killed by Hamas, who helped start an organization that brought together Israelis and Palestinians who had lost loved ones. That father said, "I gradually realized that the only hope for progress was to recognize the face of the conflict." The world looks at a conflict that has grinded on and on and on and sees nothing but stalemate. For the Palestinians, symbolic actions to isolate Israel at the United Nations in September won't create an independent state. As for Israel, it's important that we tell the truth.
Here now to take a look at how social media can play a role in the Israel-Palestine conflict, our professor at UCLA in Media and Information Studies, Ramesh Srinivasan, news editor at TakePart.com, Shaya Tayefe Mohajer, and comedian Yasser Lester. Welcome to the show, everybody.
Hi.
Good to have you all here. Thanks for being here. We continue to see changes in countries throughout the Middle East, and it often plays out on social media. But so what? Why does it matter when and where these developments happen? And Shay, I want to start with you. Earlier we talked about in the decoder the Iran deal. We've seen the leaders of Iran, even the leaders of Israel, the United States as well, tweeting about this. We even saw the head of Twitter get involved at one point and get a response from the Iranian government himself. What's the impact of this new type of diplomacy on our lives, would you say?
I think it's huge. It's probably the biggest baby step imaginable, in that we haven't had conversation openly between these two governments in my lifetime. So just that we're tweeting and then the president of Iran retweets an American tweet, this is huge and this is new and it's really exciting for the future of diplomacy there.
But Ramesh, a lot of people would say, it's just a PR game like whatever PR tools were available to us before then.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions about why this new president of Iran was elected, and certainly what does this have in terms of a role to play in terms of the larger story. But I think it's really important to realize that just one's use of social media tools is not enough to affect change. It's really important what you build out of your experiences with any technology, any tool, any use or any engagement with the world around you.
What do you make of, I don't know if you saw this, but I was referring to Jack Dorsey, who was one of the guys behind Twitter, who actually tweeted to Rouhani and got a response about the fact that, yes, he is on social media, but no, many people in Iran don't have access, actually, to the tools that he's using.
You're getting at the real question, and that's actually the question of why this sort of explanation of the revolutionary moment, the Green Revolution in Iran, was sort of seen as very unsuccessful, because there was this idea, there was this narrative that Twitter was powering this activist movement, and it might have been, but it was also powering the regime, right? So President Rouhani is cosmopolitan. He's the gentle face of an Iranian regime. Perhaps he's a progressive leader who actually has bravery in his heart and wants to enact some real change. But that remains to be seen. And the fact that he uses Twitter has very little to do with his engagement in a really generative new political change, you know?
I would say that there is a note of optimism, though, and that we haven't really seen a lot of this before, and that, I mean, even with the Green Revolution, for example, Iranians had a bloody revolution followed by a bloody war. I'm not sure they were ready for an Egypt-style coup d'etat. But what they did achieve was a government that understands it's under scrutiny, and that government has, whether it's going to last or whether it's just PR for now, has made some moves. So it's exciting and
perhaps in the longer term that affected change. But what we do know is that the government, during the Green Revolution, was very involved in its uses of new media, posing as double agents, mining Twitter feeds to spy on activist movements, My main work has been based in Egypt over the last 3 years, and I've seen a lot of success in how people have used social media, but moved out of that space to affect real institutional change.
So
but we're hopeful. We're hopeful. Yeah.
So I want to turn back to Israel and Palestine for just a moment. I asked my Twitter followers at home, how does this conflict impact your life? And these are followers all over the globe. And the responses I got, I think, are really telling about who follows me on Twitter. We got one here from Brian Williams, who said, as an American atheist, it doesn't affect me one bit. It's just violence over imaginary
Just for
friends.
the record, not the NBC News.
Different Brian Williams.
No, it's the same one.
Yeah. And then I've got one here from Alec Lowry, who said, it's another example of people killing each other to determine who has a more peaceful imaginary friend. So kind of the difference between political differences and religious differences aside, I mean, Yasser, in some respects, we wouldn't even be having these conversations without social media, but does the internet really always facilitate meaningful conversation, or is it just kind of an echo chamber like you can sometimes see when a lot of people are just agreeing with each other?
I personally think that no matter what people say, that there's always good that comes out of it. You know what I mean? It's like at the end of the day that those two people, regardless of what their viewpoints are, wouldn't be having the dialogue. You know what I mean? So you're always going to come out a little more educated than you were before. And just in terms of the conflict in general, I worked at McDonald's growing up, and had I been able to talk to someone at Burger King, I would be like, hey, none of us are making money. Let's all go work at KFC. And I feel like that is the heart of this entire conflict.
Beautiful analogy, if I might say so. And if I might also say, an interesting part of Today 194 focuses on how youth in the Middle East are using social media. Let's take a look at that.
I was born in 1987. 70% of my life was in violence. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes is the first Intifada, then to the second Intifada. This maybe gave me like a push and like a motivation to be an active person. I'm active in the social networks. With blogging, you can hear people's opinion, not only leaders or whoever. Now you can listen to the alternative voice. And this is actually what I do sometimes on Facebook. I join like this very racist Jewish groups that hate the Palestinians, and I keep posting links. And then we start a discussion.
So could the solution really be as simple as starting the discussion? As usual, it's complicated. Ramesh, let me go to you on this. How much credit do you think, and we'll get back to Israel and Palestine in a second, but how much credit do you think, you do a lot of work on Egypt, social media should get for actually fueling the Arab Spring and the revolutions that we saw?
Well, people that are really intelligent in the world around them use whatever tools are around them, right? And so social media tools, which were available to a very small percent of the overall Egyptian population back in 2011, were used very cleverly by those activists. They were using them to influence mainstream media journalists. So they were putting stuff on Twitter that they knew would get broadcast to millions of people through Al Jazeera or through CNN.
Yeah, I was going to say, particularly around the world, not necessarily just for the domestic audience.
Precisely. And they were feeding that back into their local audiences because most people in Egypt have access to televisions. It's a very satellite TV, very visual culture, but not necessarily a social media culture, especially not in 2011. So you don't give tools credit, you give people's intelligence credit. And if people know how to exploit tools rather than using those tools to look at their navels, but they use those tools to create larger publics, larger movements, shape larger social change, then it's just really a powerful story.
And so you were saying earlier, I mean, social media, it can only accomplish so much, especially when only a small percentage of people have access to it. So what else does have to be in place for real change to be effected?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, it has a lot to do. I've seen in the last 3 years an incredible maturity, an incredible growth of maturity in how youth activists in Egypt have figured out that they were kind of seduced by that Facebook revolution narrative, but they really looked past that and they realized it's about us, it's not about Facebook. In fact, Facebook's like from Palo Alto. That's so strange. Like, that's not us. So they kind of realized that it's a lot about how they use those tools to build those larger publics. So they realized that, we might be into human rights or democracy, but someone who's working in the street cares about whether they can pay for their home, or pay enough money to get married, or buy tomatoes on the street, as I've talked about before. So they figure out ways to spin this, build networks across these different technologies, across these different barriers.
So are people misguided in thinking, Shaya, that, I mean, we saw in the clip from the film that social media could actually, particularly between Israelis and Palestinians, where the situation is actually very different from any of the other places we've talked about so far, to build a bridge between these people in these different nations, or at least if it becomes State 194, as we'd like to see in the film, or as it's talked about in the film. Does it even matter if the leaders don't agree ultimately at the end of the day? How many people are talking on social media?
I think if Iran's any example, the conversation can force the leaders to change their thinking, to have a conversation, to engage in a more realistic discourse. I think that particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we've been hearing the same unfortunate arguments, and it hasn't gone anywhere in a really long time. It's why people get bored with the story, and it's unfortunate because it's a huge story. It's extremely important that we have peace in the Middle East. So if social media can do anything to make that conversation more relevant, to bring leaders to task in a way that journalists and history has not been able to, and to force answers, I think that's where the power of social media lie.
For you at home, do you want to be a part of the solution? Here is how you can take part. Shay, how can we be better informed about what's happening in the Middle East, especially with Israel-Palestine?
I think the key way is to look for people to be interested in who aren't necessarily the leaders, because I think people are doing really adventurous, exciting, and open-hearted things with each other in Israel and Palestine. And to be honest, it's easy to become disenchanted with the headlines of this leader says he still doesn't care, and this leader says he still doesn't care. Or even when they do have a peace accord, we're just so used to being disappointed. When the talks start, like there's just this feeling of fear. So I think we need to bolster ourselves a little bit with alternative sources of news. We can engage in Twitter in a way that we never have been able to before.
Like takepart.com.
Like takepart.com.
Yasser, what do you think? You think that can it really make a difference?
Absolutely, because I mean, the problem right now, I feel like when these headlines come out, is that they're always sensational in their literature, but it's never sensational in the action, And I feel like that's where most of it lies, is that for something like stupid, let's say keyboard cat, for instance, you know what I mean? That it was just something that got people involved so quickly because it was something that was so interactive. And I think that's the one thing that all of this has kind of been missing, is that we always have something that says so-and-so doesn't agree with so-and-so, but there's never that next level push in to say that, like, go out and, sign a petition or whatever it is. But even like with the White House petition sign-up things, you know what I mean? It's like now there's that extra step that makes you feel like you're involved. So I feel like the more we get that. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say we only got about 20 seconds, but I want to get your take here too.
Yeah, I mean, what's really powerful is for people to think outside of the box, think outside of like the standard institutions that exist in the world around them, think about the issues, the things that they really believe in, and think about how they want to create that world around them. That world could include using technology, but that world is much larger than using technology, and you have to force people to listen. And that's the story I'm seeing in Egypt.
Well said. All right, thank you so much to all of you. Good conversation. And State 194 will begin airing on Pivot this Sunday, December 3rd. In the meantime, head over to takepart.com/State 194 to download the State 194 primer and better understand the issue.
Up next, director Rotimi Rainwater takes us behind the scenes